Hi there. In the previous lecture we talked about ceteris paribus. There we saw a word dependent variable. So let's talk a little more about what dependent variable means and also what independent variable means. Alright. So dependent variable, essentially, remember we took an example which talked about yield of potatoes dependent upon, let's say, factors like rainfall, use of fertilizers, soil quality, so on. Okay, and we said, okay, we have to stop somewhere, so we assumed that other factors other than these don't really affect this. Okay, the rest of them, they don't affect this. So that is what we called as ceteris paribus. Now a dependent variable is a variable which is the variable in question. So what were we talking about? We were talking about yield of potatoes, right? And the variable was dependent upon what? It was dependent upon, let's say, soil fertility, it was dependent upon use of fertilizers, it was dependent upon the amount of rainfall. Okay, so considering these three factors, this factor, this yield of potatoes, is now dependent upon these three. So this actually is a dependent variable. Got it? If we were to represent this in terms of an equation, let's say, we can always write something like yield of potatoes yp is equal to, and again, since it's a hypothetical example, we can write something like 2f plus, let's say, soil fertility is measured on the basis of pH levels or something. Okay, so we can write the measurement that this is how much soil fertility is needed, S square plus another one, the amount of rainfall. Okay, so something like 1 by 2 R. Now this is our equation for the total yield of potatoes we are going to experience. Alright. Okay. So again, in this equation, y is the dependent variable. A variable, let's read the definition, a variable whose value depends upon another economic event. So in this case, another economic event would be the amount of rainfall, let's say, right, the amount of fertilizers, the amount of the kind of soil fertility. Okay, for example, spending by an individual is dependent upon the receipt of income. Okay, so let's say somebody is spending this much, let's call it spending is X. Okay, let's say somebody is spending, or we can also call it consumption. Okay, so let's call it C. Consumption of an individual is dependent upon how much income, receipt of income meaning how much that person is earning. That means how much that individual is earning. Okay, so let's say we can represent it as something like CI is equal to 0.75 I, which is income for our individual, and this becomes our equation. Are we not really talking about other factors, something like how much, let's say, certain expenditures, unforeseen circumstances that person might encounter? Of course, but then remember, in the previous lecture we talked about ceteris paribus. Okay, ceteris paribus. It is that ceteris paribus is indeed applicable in this circumstance also. Okay, so we are saying in our little model, the consumption or the amount of spending is dependent on the amount of income that person is making. Make sense? So this consumption or spending is our independent variable. Okay, this is the independent variable. That's it. And since we have already talked about dependent variable, let's also talk about independent variable. Now you must have understood that when we took that example, something like the spending of an individual is dependent upon the amount of income. Let's say something like amount of income that person has. Generally in economics, actually income is represented with Y. So let's get into that habit right away. Okay, so this is an independent variable. Why? Because why is it an independent variable, not the independent variable Y? It is an independent variable because it is generally assumed that it's not really exactly in your control how much income you're gonna make. And let's say even if someone is operating on a fixed salary, alright, when we are talking in general, what we are saying with the help of our model is that with an understanding of how much that person is making, okay, with the understanding of how much that person is making, we can actually find something about how much that person is going to consume. So this becomes our dependent variable and this becomes our independent variable. So this can take values independently. This is not really dependent in this model. You must be thinking, okay, even income is dependent on several other factors. Of course it is. But considering this model, that we are only talking about how much a person will spend. In this model, the basic parameter on which this parameter is dependent is this, and hence it can be called as independent variable. Okay, so these are basic ideas I want you to remember. As we progress, we'll take these ideas for granted. We'll not really revisit them a lot. Okay, you can always watch the lecture again obviously, but they're not very complicated as you can imagine. This is a basic glossary. Okay, so, and if you have any questions, obviously comment section is open to you. If you think that I should record lectures in Hindi, I understand, because people who are from English medium, they can't, for them it's probably easy, and the terminology is also exactly the same. People who are not very well versed with English language, they might want certain explanations in Hindi. If that is the case, please let me know in the comment section. I'll try to do whatever. I'll try to make a separate lecture or something. I'll be keeping the terminology something like dependent, independent variable in English, but some other part of the explanation could be in Hindi or Marathi. Alright, thanks a lot. Keep listening, keep making notes. This lecture series will go on for a while.